Right. Hi, good morning, everyone. And thank you so much for joining us here at the 2021 Virtual Fall Conference for the Washington State Council for Social Studies. My name is Unchong Kim. By day, I teach civics over at Shorewood High School in the Shoreline School District, just north of Seattle. And sort of by my alternative joy and passion here is helping to put together this fall conference for you for the Washington State Council. Myself and my co-chair, Sarah Treewergy, who'll be helping with the chat management and all sorts of other things this morning, are happy to welcome you to this conference. We're very excited to be bringing it to you. And we want to also thank, besides the Council itself for providing this opportunity, we want to thank OER as well for being amazing partners, making this entire project possible. So thank you specifically to Bob and Sandy for helping us put this together. We are very excited to kind of bring you the program today that we have. The theme is Fact or Fake, Navigating the New Information Landscape. We want to work on information and misinformation. I think in our current sort of state of affairs, difficult to have a conversation really without sort of some shared facts. And so we have three amazing presenters today who will not only help you navigate that for yourselves, but hopefully give you some tools you can use with your students in the classroom so that we can prepare them for, the current state as well as what they are going to be dealing with in the future. So we'll begin the conference this morning in a bit with Jevin West, Associate Professor over at University of Washington. He'll be our keynote address. At 10 o'clock, Sean Lee and Liz Krause will join us with some, sort of tools and a way to sort of think about teaching misinformation in the classroom. And so they will provide us an opportunity to do that. And then Leslie James will wrap up our program at 11 o'clock to share with you just sort of some of the challenges that may come with teaching this and how to address those challenges and overcome those obstacles. What I'd like to do before we sort of get, and then at 12 o'clock, just a heads up, there will be an optional. So this is not part of the 3-hour clock hours, but if you'd like to join. I have some materials that I have used in my classroom regarding misinformation, teaching that with students. It'll be a video preview of a few items that I think you might find helpful, some resources you may find helpful to use in your classroom, or at least even for your own use and knowledge as well. Before we get much further on, I would love to welcome you all. Could we take a moment and in the chat, if you don't mind, telling us where you're zooming in from? So either city or school district, if you wouldn't mind doing a quick introduction in the chat. That would be amazing. Awesome. It is so lovely to have you all join us. All right, well, welcome everyone from all across the state and in so many different areas. This is one of the joys and benefits of Zoom, is that we get to draw from folks from all over in a way that we couldn't in person. Before we begin and before I do the introduction here for our keynote address, I do want to also let you know that there are more conferences coming up here from the Washington State Council for Social Studies. The the K-8 conference in February will be on Saturday, February 5th. If you'd like to join for that. It is also a virtual event. It'll be Saturday, February 5th, and the theme is Race, Resistance, and Resilience, the Asian American Experience. Orally and team have been putting together an amazing program. It will feature a conversation with a survivor of the Japanese internment camps who can speak about the effects of that experience as a child. So Mary Tsukamoto, and then a contemporary Japanese activist, Stan Shikuma, will be there to talk about sort of that particular experience. There'll also be a panel discussion with Tom Ikeda from Densho, Dan Brown, who wrote Facing the Mountain, and Jane Kuwahara, who'll share research on the little-known Hawaiian internment incarceration camps as well. So that's just the beginnings of the program. If you'd like to join, more information will be available in the coming weeks. The other program that we have for you coming up will be Spring Conference, and that is organized by our illustrious Wendy Eubank. And the theme for that will be Shared Home. She's already got some featured keynotes and speakers for that, including Linda Mapes of the Seattle Times, Hillary Franz, the Washington Lands Commissioner, and Warren Seeler of the Spokane Tribe Natural Resources Department. We hope that you are available and interested in continuing with us on our journey here, continue being learners as well as educators. So we invite you to those programs, and more information will be available on our website as we move forward. All right. Thank you again, everyone, for letting us know where you're zooming in from, and good morning to you all. Let me go ahead and do my introduction here for our keynote, so we don't waste any moments here. But Jevin West is joining us. He's an associate professor of information of the Information School at the University of Washington. He's the co-founder of the new Center for Informed Public at UW, and really the goal of this is sort of our goal this morning in small part. To resist strategic misinformation, promote an informed society, and strengthen our democratic discourse. I think in many respects, regardless of what you teach and where you teach, is sort of a core part of social studies education. His research and teaching is focused on the impact of technology on science and society, with a focus of spreading or slowing the spread of misinformation. Jevin's also the co-author of Calling Bullshit, The Art of Skepticism in a Data-Driven World, which helps us non-experts question numbers, data, and statistics. So Jevin, good morning, and thank you so much for joining us. We look forward to hearing all you have to say.
Well, good morning, and thanks so much for the invitation and for the introduction, and thank all of you for taking a Saturday morning to talk about misinformation, disinformation. I wake up thinking about it and go to bed thinking about it, so it's easy for me to talk about it. But really, when we talk about intervening in this crisis of misinformation that we seem to be living in, there's no better thing that we can be doing than talking to educators and working with educators. I mean, I'm an educator myself, of course, but that's what we're going to talk about today. And I want to allow all of you to sort of guide that conversation at some point. So what I'm planning on doing today is talking about some of the things that sort of on the forefront of my mind in relation both to education and some of the challenges, but also some of the topics that we can talk to our students about. And I've had many chances to talk to high school students and middle school students about this issue. And surprisingly, they're always further along on this topic than I give them credit for. And a lot of times I learn from them. So I don't tend to sort of bring it down too much. A lot of times if we're talking about policy, for example, I'll get right into issues of free speech and Section 230. They really get involved in that. So I'll talk about some of those topics, but I want to allow you to sort of answer or ask questions and provide comments throughout. So I'll try to keep it at about 25, 30 minutes, and then we'll open it up to discussion. So thanks again for listening. And I am going to share my slides. Hopefully this works. It usually does, but sometimes it doesn't. So I always have to hold my breath just a little bit here. Let's see, where do I have it? Okay, should show, second, sorry. It's a Saturday morning, I should know how to do this. All right, sharing, there it is. Okay, now I see my PowerPoint slide. Can everyone see that, hopefully? If you don't, then yell out loud and I'll keep going. All right, so I wanna just pose a question for all of you, because it's something that rings in my head every day. I mean, obviously, I spend time doing research in this area. We have a center and a community of researchers that do this. I work a lot with educators. And this is a question that keeps coming back to me. How do we, you, everyone solve a problem like misinformation? How do you do that? And what makes it so difficult? And I think this is a prompt all by itself that you could have with students, that I've had with students, with researchers, policymakers, doesn't matter who it is. And this really starts to generate all sorts of conversations and questions, partly because everyone is involved with this in some ways. Unless you were sort of hibernating for the last 5 years, maybe even 10 years, everyone is aware of this issue. And so our sort of attempt, of course, at addressing this is this Center for an Informed Public at the University of Washington, which we launched in the fall of 2019, actually December of 2019, which was, it seemed, minutes before the pandemic. And a lot of our effort, of course, has been combating misinformation and disinformation around COVID, but it certainly extends beyond COVID. And we spend a lot of time thinking about it in any kind of crisis situation, elections, major events that occur that sort of leads to situations where you see a lot of this. Most of what we do, or a lot, I wouldn't say most, a lot of what we do is research-based. We do work, gathering lots and millions of conversations on a daily basis, publicly available conversations. And by the way, we do have IRB support to do that. And we collect these kinds of things and we look at how ideas and people are amplified. We look at the ways in which some things go viral and some don't. We look at strategic misinformation. But we also spend a lot of time there we go. We spend a lot of time in community engagement and policy, and of course education, which is close to my heart, and it's an area that I spend a lot of time in the center thinking about. If you want to look at some of the details of all the things we do, we have all sorts of reports and newsletters. Please sign up if you're interested in this topic. Just go to cip.uw.edu and you can sign up for our newsletters. We send them about once a month or a couple months, and it shows research papers coming out of our group and education resources and tools, et cetera, and everything we make is freely available. So that's just we target librarians and teachers, et cetera, around this. One of our big projects that we engage with the high school community in the state of Washington, and actually becoming more national, is something we call Misinfo Day. We spend an entire day with high school students thinking about Misinfo Day. And Liz, there's a picture of Liz right here, and Sean Lee, who's going to be the next speaker, going to talk about Misinfo Day Junior, which is happening on high school campuses. And I think it's one of the coolest programs that's in this space. And so please, contact them if you're interested, and you can contact us and we'll make those connections for you. I do want to say that, a lot of this is about media literacy. And it's not that media literacy is a new thing. A lot of teachers and organizations have been putting out content for a long time. I do think there is a need for continued innovation in the space, and especially a real focus on digital civics and ethics as well. I think we all sort of see the importance of that it's not just about understanding how the internet works, but how to engage with the people that are on that internet in a really positive way. I'm going to switch over real quick to a set of resources, because I usually put this at the end of the talk, but then I realized this is a really important thing for teachers that are trying to incorporate this into their classroom. So I'm going to show just a few of the resources. We have way more than what I'll show here, but give you an example. You can go to our website here, where you can see some of the things that we're doing. We just put up something here around vaccine misinformation and narratives. There's one of our postdoctoral scholars, Colina Koltai, who's done a ton of work tracking misinformation on vaccines for a long time, well before COVID. She did her dissertation on this at the University of Texas, Austin. She's been doing a bunch of webinars. We have all sorts of trusted journalism campaign that we put out about, indicators of trust within journalism. We have a whole bunch of lectures that my colleague Carl Bergstrom and I have put out freely available around how misinformation and numbers are available. Kate Starber, our now director, I was the director for the last 2 years, and Kate Starber is a new director, where she talks about this crisis and what disinformation is. We have deepfakes in US election, watching out for deepfakes. We have some quizzes you can give to students that are interactive, and they're supposed to be fun and empowering, not scary quizzes. We've worked with the Pacific Science Center on building virtual exhibits when they were closed during COVID around identifying misinformation in charts and things like facts in COVID. We have the SIFT method, which Mike Caulfield, who used to be at Washington State University and doing great work, he's now with us at the center. We're so excited, and we're still working with Washington State, of course, on all this. And then Misinfo Day webinars. We have Stand with the Facts lecture series. The Which Face is Real is a game I created to bring public attention to deepfakes, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's all sorts, and we point to others. I wanted to just go over to this website just to say all these resources are available, and they're great ways to sort of get into the topic if you haven't been. All right, so I'm going to go back now. I'm moving fast. Sorry for moving so fast, but I want to make sure I delivered lots of content today. So those are the kinds of things that you can look for as I share my screen again. Here we go. There. And then we have some projects we've been building over the last year and a half or so. This is one of them that does rapid response, real-time rapid response monitoring of misinformation. We do that in collaboration with Stanford University and others. This is a large multi-stakeholder collaboration with government, with community organizations, journalists, researchers, even in the industry also that sort of, runs a lot of these platforms. And we focus this mostly around elections at first, and we put a long report out. We're also doing this around vaccine misinformation. And we hired Mike Caulfield, actually, who I just mentioned, who helps us a lot with media literacy education, but also he does a lot of he will be leading the rapid response work. So let me get back to this question. How do you solve a problem like misinformation? And my colleagues and I, we just recently wrote a perspective on this. It's actually it's going to be published here in the next month or so at Science Advances, where we talk about this issue. And I'm just going to give you just a quick little sneak peek of some of the things that we talk about, mostly around sort of what some distinguishing qualities that we have learned in doing research in this space for many years. And there's a whole bunch of them, but I'm just going to mention three here. And I mention these both as a kind of a research talk, but also a talk where I engage students on. And you'll see that these three questions hit some of the major different areas that we hit in our center. One of them is around the computational social science, HCI, technology studies issues. Then, of course, there's the legal and policy issues around this, speech versus action. And then mistaken belief versus conviction deals more with the psychology, behavioral sciences side of this. It just gives you a sample of the ways that we span this issue of misinformation, that you have to think about it in these multidisciplines. Of course, the social sciences are really the ideal place to talk about this because it does sort of weave in the political, behavioral, the economic, et cetera, all the things that sort of drive this. So let me give you an example of how I had distinguished at least misinformation from disinformation. A lot of times people think we can just throw AI at solving misinformation because you might get something like this. This was a Facebook post from an individual actually here close in Washington. It was in Woodinville, Washington. A chiropractor put out a post on Facebook that said, hey, look at this. CDC essentially is hiding 94% of their deaths, and only 6% of the deaths of COVID were caused by, or 6% of the deaths were COVID only. And the point here was that while CDC might be hiding this, of course, they're not hiding this. And this individual had mixed up what are called comorbidities, which means if you die of one disease, but you had another, like you died of COVID, but you had diabetes, it doesn't mean that you didn't die of COVID. You still died of COVID, but you had this comorbidity. It'd be like, dying in a car crash with COVID. In your death certificate, it wouldn't say that you died of COVID, you died of a car crash, but you had COVID. Anyway, long story short, there was misinformation. It got amplified and reached a major QAnon influencer. That exploded, and it actually reached all the way to the White House and was retreated. Now, this is an individual piece of misinformation. This would be misinformation. It does get amplified. There might be some elements of disinformation, but it's discrete. It's something that you could have a fact checker, which, by the way, there were fact checkers. Actually, Dean Miller of Lead Stories actually took this down or debunked this. He's actually here in the Seattle area and used to work for the Seattle Times. And he, you can have, you can do a fact check on this, but actually there are much more difficult. It's much more difficult to deal with when you have something like the pandemic video, which it's more strategic. This was a video that was released that had tons of misinformation around vaccinations. It featured a discredited scientist, Judy Mukovats, who has pushed out lots of misinformation around vaccines and mask wearing. But this video, it involved many different stakeholders. It was already being promoted before. It was sort of aligning with a lot of the narratives at the time. It was there were conspiracy theories around Fauci and Gates and vaccinations, et cetera, around this issue, not just in the video, of course. The point here is that disinformation tends to be much more difficult to identify than these discrete pieces of misinformation. And that's why AI won't solve this. AI can't identify these narratives and framings that exist and some of the motivations, the political, financial, et cetera, that exist around things like a disinformation campaign. The point here is that if we only focus on misinformation, it will lead us to dead ends in research, education, and policy. We need to be able to distinguish between purposeful misinformation, which is disinformation, and just things that are false, whether by accident or purposeful. So that's one distinguishing. So what can we do? Maybe AI and certainly fact checkers and journalists can create more resilient information environments, and certainly we need to create more resilient consumers, which is what us as educators are trying to do. But disinformation is a little more difficult, and it's something that I think should be more part of curriculum development. It's a lot harder though, and that's something that we're trying to help develop. As we study this, we see the challenges specifically around disinformation, where in this case, you need to follow people and strategies rather than just individual content alone. And for legislation, you have to address the level really in incentives, and there's all sorts of other things you can do, but we don't need to get into some of the legal issues here. The point is we need to distinguish these two. Now, let me just mention speech versus action. In conversations with students, or of course with the public, or things that you see online, there's always a discussion about censorships and First Amendment when talking about what's been happening on these platforms. There's this real confluence of discussions around speech, because a lot of times people think that their First Amendment rights are being violated on Facebook or Twitter, for example, if there was a banner on something they posted or whatever. The thing that most people mix up, at least around free speech and the First Amendment, is that it doesn't necessarily apply to private platforms like Facebook or Twitter. They're private firms, but it does protect them, interestingly. So it's almost the opposite of what people would want. They want their First Amendment protected on platforms, and maybe at some point society considers them the public square, and it comes to that. But it's important to distinguish speech and action, because it gives us some opportunity to maybe surpass that barrier of accountability that a lot of platforms have been able to hide behind for some time. And so when we talk about what we can do, and students always want to know, like, I have some ideas, and they actually have great ideas. And so getting them to talk about some of the legal issues around this is a great engagement topic, because they have lots to say about it. And it's a great way to teach things like constitutional law and of course federal law. And here's an example of federal law. For most people are familiar with Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, because it's everywhere in the news. There's hashtags. I have students that ask me all the time about it. But what's interesting about Section 230 is that both like Democrats and Republicans sort of want to attack it, but for different reasons. We can talk about that later. But the point here is that just because something involves speech doesn't mean that the government can't regulate. Neither the Constitution nor federal law grant legal protections for harmful conduct just because the action involves speech. Let me give you an example. The Stolen Valor Act was pushed by the Bush administration in 2005. It was a law to address some of the lying that was going around using medals of honor in the military. The problem is that it was struck down actually in 2012 because it ran straight into to free speech. It was then reenacted with an amendment in 2013 by the Obama administration, saying that actually we do want to impose it. It is against the law if you lie about medals, if it leads to material gain. So the point here, this is a way of explaining how just because something involves speech doesn't mean that it can't be prosecutable. And so in this case, this is a good chance to sort of talk to students about, what the legal constraints are around free speech, because it's going to be a discussion point in the news for a long time. And it's just important to be able to distinguish between speech and action. I mean, here's an example. If I was to start selling toothpaste to cure COVID and I was making money off it, that's not just a free speech issue. There's an act involved there, and that could be prosecutable. Okay, let me end with this sort of last one, and then I'm going to go into a couple other just points about just teaching these concepts more specifically. So there's another issue here is the challenge, of course, is when talking with the public about intervening in misinformation, there tends to be sort of two different groups, those that are sort of driven by mistaken belief and those driven by conviction. And when it comes to, of course, vaccination or masks, that's been one of the most contentious issues in America and also outside of America too, when it comes to COVID. People that have a mistaken belief could be individuals that could be pushed in one way or the other if they had good information. And this is, of course, the group that we focus on primarily. But then there is the group that just truly believes in their heart of hearts that vaccines, for example, or masks aren't safe. And this really pushes us in a whole new realm of education content, of sometimes de-radicalization kind of challenges, conspiracy theory kinds of challenges. And it also actually tells us what we can and can't do when it comes to policy. And so the reason why I separate those, I don't have a solution to either one of those. We have to work with it. It's just that it's important that we sort of separate those when developing content, education content, and also policies when it comes to this particular issue. Now, there's been a lot of attention around what's called the backfire effect. And this is the idea that as you give, let's say, an individual that believes that vaccines are sort of a ploy by Bill Gates to sort of track the world or to sort of reduce the population of the world, if you give them more facts, sometimes they'll just be more entrenched. There's this backfire effect. But recent research has shown that maybe the backfire effect isn't all that, is very nuanced and context-based. And now there's been this resurgence of wanting to sort of get back to sort of putting good information in front of people and not being afraid to put banners and other things on social media and in our education content. And the point here is that this research is ongoing, and I think that's why we need to be in the classroom experimenting with these different ideas. But really, ultimately, all of this really comes down to, now we're kind of getting to why educators are the most important part of this solution. When we talk about, how do you solve a problem like misinformation? Well, ultimately, it's educators. And one of my favorite quotes that sort of I sometimes will start a quarter class on is from John Alexander Smith from 1914. He says, "Nothing that you will learn in the course of your studies will be of the slightest possible use to you in afterlife, save only this, that if you work hard and intelligent, you should be able to detect when a person is talking rot." And then in my view is the main, if not the sole purpose of education. And it's that what we can do, this is what we can teach students to do, is to identify when they're running into misinformation, to make them more resilient information consumers. I have a class, as was mentioned in the introduction, with my colleague Carl Bergstrom. We've been teaching it for several years, having so much fun with it. It's actually being taught around the world at many different universities. There's a little bit of a BS movement, which is exciting. It's being taught a lot of these different places. We also have a book. Actually, it's being used in colleges. In high school, it's a little more challenging because of the words we use on the cover, but actually we take it very serious and try not to overuse it. And we talk about why we use the word, but we're also putting some materials, we have put materials together just for high schoolers. So if you're interested, feel free to reach out to me or anyone in the CIP, and we can talk about some of the materials and the high school teachers we've worked with, trying to teach them about misinformation that comes wrapped in data. That's really my education focus. I do talk about media literacy writ large, and I do a lot of work, of course, in the research side of this, but we spend a lot of time thinking about misinformation that comes in data and graphics. I'll give some examples in just a moment. We talk about all sorts of different things, but I want to just jump. I've literally, 70 or 80 hours of lectures that I could sort of share with you, but if I was to compress to a few different things, I wanted to talk about some of the tools that you can use, that students can use when dealing with misinformation. And a lot of times, like I mentioned, this comes wrapped in data, because data seems, it's weighty, it seems sciencey, it seems precise and replicable. It seems to sort of come straight from nature. So when someone sees a number or hears a stat, they sometimes give it more credit than is due. And so there's all sorts of techniques we teach in the class. One of them that I really like is called Fermi estimation, and it's from an individual. It was a physicist, Fermi, and actually there's a Fermi lab in Illinois that is based after this amazing physicist who could do calculations on the back of his napkin over dinner that would sometimes take years to do to estimate certain things in the physics world. But I want to show you a little video that was made that explains this better than I can in that short amount of time. So I'm going to show that now. Let's see here. There it is. Sorry, it's a little harder with the video. I'm hoping to put this up. And all of this I can show later on as well. Here it comes. Sorry. Okay, here it is. Okay, so share. Share sound. Here it is. I hope you can hear it. I'm hoping. Okay, here we go.
Well, one of the things we can do is try to develop skills for spotting bullshit. And one of the more effective tools out there is something called Fermi estimation. This was inspired by a physicist named Fermi who was really good at doing calculations on the back of a napkin. And his trick was to just spend time thinking about the powers of 10. So just estimating in these powers of 10, and in doing so could come to calculations really quickly.
So let's give you an example. Representative Mo Brooks suggested that the sea level rise might not have anything to do with melting ice caps. It might be because the cliffs of Dover were eroding.
The waves crashing against the shorelines, and time again, you're having the cliffs crash into the sea. All of that displaces water, which forces it to rise, does it not?
Let's try out Fermi estimation with this problem.
To the nearest power of 10, the White Cliffs of Dover are about 10 kilometers long, about 100 meters high. Let's suppose an entire kilometer fell into the ocean. That's 1 billion cubic meters fallen into the ocean. So how much would 1 billion cubic meters raise the ocean?
So there's about 360 trillion square meters of water.
Well, you dump 1 billion cubic meters into 360 trillion square meters. That raises you up about 0.000003 meters. That is 3 micrometers. A human hair is about 100 micrometers. So if the cliffs of Dover and 30 other cliffs like it collapsed today, that would raise the oceans by a hair.
So what you're saying, Carl, is that you would raise the ocean.
Thank you, Jevin. I really needed.
All right, so that's a little bit one of many tools. We create some of these videos just to make it fun and learning these tips with some examples. We try to do our best in balancing this, at least when there are issues of political concern. So we have, like, let's say, you know, we find a silly thing on MSNBC, we try to balance that with silly things that we see on Fox. And it also, at least with a lot with our senators. But this is one of many different tools that we can teach students to do more often, to create these habits of mind when dealing with data. We also talk about misinformation in and about science. So my colleague who was on that video, Carl Bergstrom, and I have done a lot of work both in the class and research around this space. We've spent a lot of time thinking about misinformation in science. Now, it doesn't mean science is broken. Science is a beautiful, beautifully powerful institution that, despite some of its challenges, still does remarkably well. I mean, look, within a very small amount of time, we've developed over 10, already at least 10 vaccinations that are being distributed around the world. And, you know, we can track the evolution of this virus in a short amount of time. It's an amazing feat that science has created, but it has some challenges too. And one of the things that it's been, you know, one of the many kinds of examples of how misinformation travels in science and then out to the public is through new communication innovations in science. So throughout the pandemic, there's been an upsurge in papers being uploaded to what are called preprint archives. It's been going on for a long time in some fields like astronomy and physics and computer science, but it hasn't been so much a way of communicating in the life sciences. And the reason why this is an important form of communication, because it gets things out quickly. Peer review takes a long time, but peer review is really important. And so when you've had journalists and society not familiar with preprint archives, you had a lot of papers like this. This is one of the most shared papers on science of all time, and it was early on in the pandemic, talking about sort of common inserts and the commonality of COVID and the HIV as a way of saying that this might be a bioweapon. And there are still investigations going on about the origin of this, but this had some mistakes on it. And it was removed, it was withdrawn. You can see in this little red box. But that didn't stop it from being shared over and over and over and over again. And like I said, one of the most shared of all time based on altmetric scores. So this is just one of many different examples of educating the public on what peer review is. Peer review is not perfect, by the way, but that there's science communication is evolving right now. And it's important that our students graduating from high school are aware of some of these things as they start referencing real science articles in the primary literature. But where does science discourse typically go off? It typically goes off in the representation and misrepresentation of numbers, because a lot of science, not all of science, there's a real value in qualitative methods, and we do a lot of that in our center. But a lot of times it can go off off kilter when there's a misrepresentation of numbers. So a lot of times it's through unfair comparisons. And let me give you an example of an infographic early on that was making a claim that, oh, COVID-19, I mean, if you compare it to things like tuberculosis, hepatitis B, et cetera, it's very small. But this was very early in the pandemic. And one thing that my colleague, Carl Bergstrom, was really pushing on this, who's my partner in a lot of this, was saying that you can't compare COVID at the beginning of its wave to these other maladies this early. And he updated it in January of this year. By the way, if it was updated, it would be far worse. This would be a much more fair comparison after it's had 1 year to go through its pandemic. The point is, typically there are unfair comparisons. Here's another example. The Georgia State Department of Health, you see visualizations and heat maps used all the time, and certainly they were in 2020. This was posted on July 2nd, and this was posted on July 17th. This was a 2-week period of vociferous debate within the Georgia State legislation about whether to close the economy, whether to have masks or not have masks. And if you look at these two pictures, it almost looks like there's no change. But there's a big problem here. It's an unfair comparison again, because the bins here used for coloring are far different. Now, they got a lot of criticism, and they did correct it, and they apologized, and they did make a lot of other mistakes too. But they claimed that it was the software that was automatically scaling data. And I believe that that was true, but that means we need to be even more careful as producers of information, as well as consumers of information. And so one thing we always remind the students is that never ascribe to malice, as is Hanlon's razor, what can be adequately explained by incompetence, but even better, never ascribe to incompetence what could be an understandable mistake. And there are misunderstandable mistakes, and that's the data civics side of things. So let me talk about one of the most important things that we can teach students when it comes to misinformation that travels in data, and that is selection bias. We have an entire chapter devoted to it. Actually, we're talking to the students literally right now in our lecture. Our lecture on Wednesday was about this. We'll be talking about it in this coming week. And this is something that comes in many different forms, but at its core, it occurs when people you sample differ systematically from the population, or whatever you're sampling with respect to the question. And one great way of explaining it is just looking at the puzzle from the industry and the insurance industry, which is, if you listen on TV or you're watching something on television, you're likely going to see some commercial from Progressive that says they're going to save you $500 on average. Same thing with Allstate. You'll save $498, $2 less. Farmers, $502. We're at $500. Geico, of course, saves you $500. So, and we even get an email. We have an email. We get these quotes all the time saying we're going to save $500 from Geico at our BS course email address. So how can every insurance company be about $500 cheaper than its competitors? Now, we have to assume that this number is real, but let's assume it's real. Well, it occurs because they're only looking at the individuals that switch. They're not looking at every person in the insurance industry. They're only looking at those who switch. So someone's not going to switch if they only save $5, but $500 might be worth the effort of finding a new insurance agent, filling out all those dumb forms, et cetera. The point is, it's a very biased sample. And we see this all over as well. We see it, this is one of the more funny ones. There was a large discussion during the fires, and there was a conspiracy that these were being started by all sorts of different groups, and that it, you see that it stopped at the borders. And this is kind of a sad thing. When we were talking about this, and professors, we had to explain that, or Carl, I think Carl was, I'm trying to see which one on this is. Yeah, Carl was being asked, others explain that Canada has also been affected, and you can kind of see these fires. I mean, it's kind of sad when you have to have a teacher tell you that fires can go across borders. But here's another example that actually went viral pretty early in the pandemic, but it prolonged for a lot longer than it should have. Dentists in New Jersey were warning that prolonged use of masks were probably leading to poor oral hygiene. They were talking about the lack of oxygen flow in the teeth, et cetera, et cetera. And their claims were based on this idea that they were getting a whole bunch of people with serious dental cavities, a higher ratio of those than those just coming in for regular checkups. Well, there's a selection bias here too, in that who's going to come into the dental office for regular checkup at the beginning of a pandemic? And so, of course, they were going to see a higher ratio of those that just had serious issues, that if they couldn't sleep and couldn't talk and couldn't think, they were going to go into the dentist. And so you'd see things like that. There was also a major selection bias issue with the Bakersfield doctor video that came out. This was a set of doctors in Bakersfield County that were testing patients in their urgent care facilities and found that 340 out of 520, about 6.6% of them were getting it, and they were able to calculate a very low, what's called an infection fatality rate. And they said this was, based on a random population. Well, people coming into their clinic because they don't feel good is not a random population, a random sample from the population. It would be like sampling, players on a basketball court in the NBA as a way of measuring the average height of America. So of course you're going to get a sample bias there. The other big issue, of course, into selection bias is something that people think they understand, but tend to have a real challenge on. That's correlation and causation. And you've noticed that I haven't talked too much about fancy statistics, and we haven't necessarily, talked about linear regression or all the things that sort of scare people about statistics and numbers. We're just talking about simple concepts that can actually identify most of the problems even before you get to those kinds of things. So correlation causation is a major problem. It's even a problem with researchers and journalists themselves. This was a study that came out. Look at the 50 most shared research studies in health outcomes. These are the 50 most shared, and half of the news articles conflated correlation and causation, and a third of the journal articles misattributed causality based on correlative evidence. So, one example of something that went viral was that, bald men were at higher risk of severe coronavirus symptoms. This was written up in Forbes, and it was based on this hypothesis that endocrine involvement in COVID pathogenesis, baldness was the same thing, was leading to COVID risk because of this endocrine activity. It was published in a legitimate Journal of American Academy of Dermatology, peer-reviewed journal. This goes to show that even peer review doesn't stop these kinds of things. It has this fancy graph explaining it. But they forgot one really important thing, that age is a risk factor for both hair loss and severe COVID as well. And Forbes retracted it, as did many others. So this is an example of ways in which we can conflate correlation and causation. And we have all sorts of examples, and there's lots of examples to pull from, where you can talk to students about these kinds of things. So the biggest thing is that numbers should always be presented in context. And that means they have to allow us to make comparisons. That's one thing that I've shown. The other thing that we talked about is sort of correlation and causation. Oops, I think I just stopped sharing. Sorry. My fault. Just hit the wrong button. And then we'll be wrapping up here so we can do questions. So this is one of the more important things that we can teach students, is to teach them about doing fair comparisons, to be on the lookout for things like selection bias, to be on the lookout for things like correlation, causation, conflation, to look at the ways in which infographics are manipulated, percentages are manipulated. These are the kinds of things that can make them better consumers of any kind of information that they see, and to do that in a way that's civically minded, and not to be accusing people of being nefarious, even though there are plenty of examples of that. That's sort of our philosophy. And when we talk about this too, we always talk about how amazing really science is. Since I talk a lot about science, we've used this to sort of track things around the world. We have these vaccinations. And when I think of superheroes, sure, Superman was great and Superwoman was great. But to me, the superheroes are those that can stop this sort of awful increase in misinformation and disinformation. Because ultimately, if we're going to solve the pandemic or deal with it as best we can, and climate change and all the other challenges that we have in society, we need to address the information and misinformation side. So the main thing here is that we're drowning in BS. A lot of it's in quantitative form. The COVID pandemic has really put it in life or death context, and numerical literacy in the context of humanities and the social sciences really can literally save lives. So with that, I'll stop and I'll open it up to questions and comments.
All right. Well, first of all, I want to thank you so much, Jevin. That was a lot of process, like for me, I'm just sort of continuing to gather. I'm definitely going to go back to the recording and take a closer look as well. We don't have any particular questions in the Q&A pod just yet, but what I would love for our participants to do is, if you're sort of like me and need a little moment here, I think it would be wonderful to be able to share what you thought or something you noticed, something you thought or felt, or something you're wondering about. I sort of use this with my students too, just to give you a moment to kind of go back and think for a moment. And then I think as questions come up, do feel free though, if there is a specific question you'd like to ask, to like put it into the chat and we'll take a look at it as well. But Jevin, if I can, because I get to have the floor, I was wondering if I could ask a question as well. For me, it's always been about balance. I think the critical thinking about sort of information, misinformation is super helpful for students. I find that sometimes though I have to balance with, because they can get pretty cynical fairly quickly and be like, well, I can't trust any of it. So how do we reach that point of both trust and, I feel like it's kind of a balancing act. Any thoughts?
It really is. Something that concerns me more than even them missing misreading an article on social media or missing a question on a test. None of that worries me as much as them just truly becoming cynical. And I've talked to many students that when I start to ask them about misinformation, they're like, oh, you don't need to tell me anything, Jevin, because I know nothing on the internet is real. It's all fake. And we don't want to raise a generation of just pure cynics. Because I think that's really the goal, by the way, of a lot of disinformation campaigns. It's really just to reduce trust. It's not just to sort of reach some sort of political or financial gain. A lot of times it's just to reduce trust. And I think that to me is more fearful. So the balance, I don't know perfectly yet exactly, because we need them to be skeptical, but not too skeptical, but just to remind them maybe of the strategies that some individuals and organizations and bad state actors have in reducing our trust. So to be aware of that, get used to, learn to look to more reliable sources more. And of course, that's a big question all by itself. Understand that, we don't have perfect information, but we have to rely on mechanisms like science, for example, is self-corrective. It does have, it does rely on experts and disciplinary experts. There is a role of experts and trust in all of this. So in short, it's super hard, but we do need to balance that. And I want to just, I just noticed a few great questions in here that I didn't get to address while we are going. Does anyone know, so how long the article was published before Forge tracked that article? I think Donetta is asking a question. Yeah, so this is interesting. I don't know the exact answer to that specific one. I can go look for it. But what we have found is that even after they've been retracted, they continue to be cited in positive light. And even when they're retracted, the retraction almost never gets as much attention as the actual original article. We have these graphs that show the takeoff of the misinformation, the retraction, and poor retraction never gets attention. So this is the sad thing about retractions. But some newspapers and journalists are better about identifying it earlier, and that can help. Of course, fact checkers help in this, but it's an interesting question. I see another point here about trying to talk to students about being skeptical and wait a bit. One of my favorite lines that I use in some of our programs, I even have a sticker on it that we have. I think it's around. Oh yeah, it's on my other computer. I can't show it, or I might pull the cord out. But it's think more, share less. Just teaching the students just to pause. I know it's so simplistic, but it actually is something I use in my own life, whether I'm reading my professional material like science or in society, sort of my personal life, is just to think a little bit more and share a little bit less. Just pausing, doing a little bit more sourcing. I can't source everything, and no one can source everything, but just a little bit more can sort of help clean this up, because the more we share, the more it feeds the algorithms that sort of find that, that's what you want to see, and that gets into your social network, and then that feeds back to you. And so that's a challenge as well. And also the one last thing, and then I'll turn it back to any questions, because I see a whole bunch of great questions and comments.
There's some questions in the Q&A pod as well. So just
okay. I'll just the one thing I just want to say is that Liz and Sean are coming up next. They are doing such fantastic work. They're teachers and librarians themselves. And I can say this as someone who does research on this every single day. The program that they're developing, the Misinfo Day Junior and Misinfo Day, and then also Teachers for an Informed Public, is such an awesome thing. I just want to call them out before I forget. That was one of my most important things I wanted to do.
Awesome.
All right, which question should I take?
So there are some questions in the Q&A pod. I'm going to just sort of start from, if we can, the beginning. I'm going to go ahead and spotlight here a couple. Ryan asks, love the title of the book and not offended at the least. I wonder if there's been pushback in K-12 from using resources on the website due to this?
Yeah, so, I thought there would be a lot more pushback. The first high school that ever adopted our content was an all-girls Catholic school in New Orleans. And they were totally fine with using the term. So we were surprised by that. And then we got a little overconfident, think, oh, well, we can just use the title. Well, we got quite a bit of pushback from some teachers that really wanted to use some of the content and resources, but saw the word, as a challenge. And so we have a non-swear word version. Actually, we strip all the swear words out. And by the way, not all our resources are even tied to that. So like our deepfake quizzes and our, like SIFT method and our spot the deepfake and a lot of the other resources we put out, it could be used by anyone. Like the one we did with Pacific Science Center, all just pure, there's no strong term like BS. But we are currently doing some work right now, writing a version specific to high schoolers. And I would like to say it's going to be ready tomorrow, but it's probably going to be many more months before that's ready.
All right. And then, Jevin, we got another question here from Liliana. Is the main distinguishing feature of disinformation that it's more coordinated, sleek, well-funded? And then, for example, the difference is an intent, right? Dis being intended to cause misunderstanding, whereas mis is more of an innocent mistake.
That's right. So did you say if there are resources around disinformation?
No, I think it was just more a question of clarification.
Yes. Oh, this is so important. Yes. And I probably went through that too fast. I should have probably cut it down half content, but I wanted to talk about so many things today because what an opportunity to talk to all of you about this because you're on the front line. So it's so important to distinguish the two. And the reason why it's important, not just for researchers to distinguish the intentional misinformation, the purposeful misinformation that has strategic intent and has, the sort of goals, financial and political, et cetera, goals, that's disinformation. Misinformation is a bigger umbrella. It includes things that are disinformation, but also just honest mistake. But that intentional element is important when developing resources and doing exercises in class. And just teaching students about the two makes them a little bit more aware of things that they might be seeing that are just honest mistake and those that might be intentionally trying to mislead them.
Awesome. And then, Jevin, we've got a couple of sort of middle school oriented questions. One's just to ask for resources, if you have any recommended resources. And I'm going to let Ellie know that we will put whatever resources is shared by Jevin and all of our presenters on our resources page for the OER site where you registered. So we'll certainly make that available. But are there any middle school oriented resources you can point to?
So here's the thing I don't want to admit. We don't have a lot of great ones at this point. And here's why. Most of my expertise, even my colleagues, is at the university level, but we've been able to work with a lot of high school teachers to start developing the high school content. Middle school is new for us. So what I would love to do, if anyone on this call is interested in the middle school realm, we're thinking about putting together a workshop at the centers, of course for the high schools too, but specifically for middle school. And we're trying to get together a little community here and maybe through Teachers for Informed Public or some of these other resources that are developing as well, but to do one around this. Now, we do have some, like the SIFT method, for example, that Mike Caulfield created, who works on our center. I find that pretty good for middle schoolers. But again, I hate to talk about it like I'm an expert because I need to learn from you. And so if you're interested, and Sean and Liz are going to talk next, they could help even facilitate. I could be there. We'd love to do that and focus it specifically for the kinds of needs that middle schoolers have. But there is stuff that I think could work from high school. And like I said, SIFT and others. I noticed News Literacy Project was up there, has lots of resources. Absolutely. There's a whole bunch of them out there, but I think it's time to start testing and developing a whole bunch more. Because if middle schoolers could get it right, but be more prepared, they'd be more prepared in high school, more prepared in college. And then if they don't go to college, they'll at least have that exposure.
And there was another middle school related about how middle schoolers can get caught up. This is from the chat on speech versus action and suggestions for better teaching that difference to younger students. If you have anything.
Yeah, the reason why I have found that to be such an engaging topic with students and also, of course, researchers and policymakers is that it's talked about in the news. So I can almost every single day I talk about this, I can get a current article from the night before. That's talking about free speech online or some of the content moderation on Facebook and Twitter, some of the current legislation and discussions around Section 230. These engage students, and teaches them about law, it teaches them about policy, it teaches them about tech, which a lot of them care a lot about because they might have parents that work for tech companies or they use the devices. And so of all the things that I have found productive is to help them distinguish between what real free speech is, how it applies or doesn't apply to platforms, but applies to individuals, and what government can do. But then also how it distinguishes itself from action. That just because something involves free speech, it doesn't mean it's not prosecutable if it has action that is prosecutable. And so there's this issue that really can create all sorts of fun exercises and discussion. And so I'm happy, I can send this perspective when it's published. The publisher accepted it and we're just waiting for it to move into print.
Awesome. And then Jevin, I certainly want to offer our attendees a break, but there is one set of questions I just want to address really briefly. There's a couple of pushback questions related to like students pushing back with strong opinions, maybe even parents doing so. Right. So I do want to tell attendees, by the way, Leslie James's talk is almost entirely centered on some of the challenges of dealing with misinformation. And this might be one of those things I'm certain she will address as well. But as we wrap up here, do you have any thoughts about the pushback question or concerns that teachers may have?
I know this might sound overconfident, but I love the pushback because it gives me the opportunity to engage with the students, and they feel like if they can engage, then I think we need more of that kind of open discussion. I've had a lot of in-person discussions that have been quite uncomfortable and been challenging, but I will have to, I say that most of the time, based on some techniques that I've learned from reading from my colleagues about how to address these more tension, kind of stricken conversations, I think it's helpful. And I don't have time to go through all the specifics, but just going in with empathy and curiosity. Of course, this is what teachers do so well already. But creating the environment for the students to be okay with that tension. So we start our class at the beginning of the fall quarter when I'm teaching a class right now. We start with an entire discussion around civics, digital civics, but civics more broadly, and what the rules are around engagement, around more difficult, tension-driven kinds of topics. And I think we should engage as much as we can. But this great thing that Sean and Liz are going to talk about, which I'm referring to again, they have the students teach the parents, and that becomes a great opportunity to sort of address some of that tension that might exist in a home around some of these issues. Because when you're talking about misinformation, there is tension, and no one gets it right all the time. And when you talk about epistemology, it's a hard kind of topic to wring your head around if you're not aware of all the different perspectives out there and stuff. So I would say I think that's a great thing. I know you need to take a break, but I just wanted to say thank you. Sorry for talking so fast this morning. But please, if you want to learn more, or like we have tons more resources that we have out there and we're giving away, just go to our website again, cip.uw.edu, and there's a resource tab. And then if you ever have questions, if we don't know the answer, we can push you to someone in the national conversation that is. So just reach out to us at the Center for Informed Public at UW anytime. The center was built specifically for helping educators, and you saw the education and journalists and librarians. So please reach out. We want to, participate and collaborate with you on trying to address this situation. So thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Jevin. We appreciate it. Folks, we're going to take a break and be back in about a few minutes. So hopefully you can strap back in. Thank you so much. We'll be back with Sean and Liz. And they'll walk you through some of the more practical ways that you can actually teach students and work with them in your classrooms to work on the issue of misinformation. Thank you so much, everybody. See you back in a few.